They called it an accident. My own son, my flesh and blood, and his wife. They threw me through a glass door. The world exploded into shards. So did my life. I lay there, bleeding in the bitter cold, listening to their hollow lies. They thought they had broken me, cast me aside, a worthless old man. But what they never knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was the $21 million I had quietly hidden away. My silence. That was the ultimate wise revenge. My name is Arthur Jensen, and this is the story of how a father's love, once blind, became his greatest strength. Before I share these painful truths, please consider subscribing to Wise Revenge and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your voice, your understanding, is a comfort in these quiet moments. I never expected to see my own blood on a kitchen floor. Not in my son's house, not at 71. The sheer indignity, the profound betrayal. It was a wound that cut deeper than any glass. It happened on a Tuesday. The day itself felt deceptive. Snow had just started falling outside, soft and steady, like the hush before something breaks. Bradley and Juliana, my son and his wife, had been tense all morning. I'd felt it, a low hum of unease. I made myself scarce, the way older men learn to do when their presence is no longer welcomed. Juliana stood at the counter, arms crossed, her voice sharper than usual. "You're still holding on to the deed, aren't you, Dad?" It was an accusation, not a question. I looked at her, then at Bradley, my son. He didn't meet my eyes. He just stood there, pretending to be absorbed by his phone, as if this conversation didn't involve him. But it did. The house still had my name on the title, and they resented it. I'd known for months they had been planning something. Whispers, missing mail, locked drawers. But I'd kept quiet. I had watched. A lifetime in business teaches you that silence is often your most powerful asset. I cleared my throat. "I'm not ready to sign anything, Juliana. Perhaps we could talk after dinner?" Juliana didn't wait. She took 2 steps forward, her eyes hard, and pointed toward the back door. "You need fresh air, Dad. You're being emotional. It's better if you step outside." Her hand gripped my arm, firm, insistent. Then something shifted. Bradley, disturbingly silent, moved to her side. I remember his hand brushing mine, a feigned gesture, but I remember the tightness in his jaw even more. The next second, I was falling. It wasn't a push, not directly. It was a coordinated, deliberate removal. My back hit the glass. There was a loud, dry crack. Then everything gave way. My world dissolved into a cacophony of shattering glass and splintering wood. I landed outside, half in snow, half in shards. The biting cold bit into my arms. The metallic tang of my own blood mixed with the bitter scent of pine. For a moment, a fleeting thought, I wondered if I might never get up again, if this was how it ended. But then, a deeper, more primal instinct took hold. I did. I always have. I would get up. From inside, Juliana's voice, sharp with feigned concern, shouted, "It was an accident. He lost his balance. We were trying to help him." But they didn't open the door. They didn't come to check. Not even Bradley, my son. He watched. He waited. And he did nothing. I pulled myself up. My hand was bleeding freely. My coat was torn. Snow soaked through my shoes. And yet, amidst the pain, all I could feel was a profound stillness. Not numbness, but a chilling clarity. The scales had fallen from my eyes. I turned away, walked down the driveway. Not a single word escaped my lips. There was nothing left to say. It wasn't the first time they had made me feel like an outsider in the home I had built, but it was the first time I saw it clearly. They wanted me gone. They had plans for this house, for their future, and in their eyes, I was no longer the father. I was an obstacle, a mere signature, a disposable relic. I didn't go to the hospital. The pain was secondary to the urgency of my thoughts. Instead, I went to a quiet diner on 4th and Maple. I sat at a back booth and ordered coffee. The waitress, Martha, didn't flinch when she saw the blood seeping through my sleeve. She just handed me napkins and said quietly, "Take your time, sir." I absorbed the quiet compassion, a stark contrast to the cold calculation I'd just endured. That night, while the snow kept falling, I booked a rental car and checked into a motel. My hands ached, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The shock had burned away the fog of sentimentality. I knew I had to act carefully, quietly. This wasn't a moment for shouting or begging. I was going to do what I had always done best. Observe, think, and then move with calculated precision. They thought I was weak. They thought I was finished. But they forgot who built this life. They forgot who made sure they never went hungry, who covered their college loans, who co-signed their mortgage, giving them the very foothold they now sought to kick me from. They forgot. But I, Arthur Jensen, did not. My silence, then, was my sword. It was just beginning its work. I stayed at the motel for 3 nights. It was quiet. I needed quiet more than I needed comfort. The morning after the glass incident, I got up early. My hand had swollen, but I cleaned and wrapped the wound. I made myself a list, just 4 things, simple, measurable, things I could control. At the top of the list, proof. I had always trusted my instincts. For decades, I'd read people in boardrooms, diffusing conflicts with a calm voice. But this wasn't work. This was my life, my son, my home. The lines had blurred. I remembered something from a few months earlier. A nagging unease had prompted me to install a small camera. Nothing fancy, just a backup, tucked into a bookshelf, disguised as a ceramic owl. I'd told no one. I never thought I'd need it. But after that moment at the door, I knew. I called an old colleague, Maya. Sharp as a tack, worked in tech security. Within hours, she recovered the footage and sent it to my private drive. I watched it once. Only once. Bradley's hand subtly shifting. Juliana's voice, cold command. My fall, the glass shattering. Then, silence. There was no denying it. This wasn't an accident. It was assault. A calculated act, followed by callous disregard. And they had covered it with feigned concern, all while eyeing the house I had paid off 27 years ago. I called a lawyer the next day. Her name was Nadine, a woman with a voice like gravel and steel. She didn't ask for drama, she asked for documentation. I gave her everything. While she began drafting a meticulous case for elder abuse and property coercion, I started putting the rest of my plans into motion. My silent strategy was unfolding. I visited the bank quietly, withdrawing just enough to handle immediate needs, to move things quickly, but not enough to raise red flags. Most of my funds remained untouched, tied up in municipal bonds, a private real estate trust, and a separate account from an old, grateful client. $21 million in total. It had taken years to build, but it was mine. I had never spoken about it to Bradley. He assumed my retirement came from a modest pension, living on Social Security. That assumption, that comfortable ignorance, kept him entrenched in his entitlement. And Juliana? She never imagined I might be more than what I looked like. Graying hair, quiet mornings, an easy figure to dismiss. But I had been building something far more substantial than their fleeting ambitions. I rented a short-term apartment in town under a different name. No frills. I needed space to think, to breathe in the absence of their calculating stares. The first thing I placed on the stark kitchen counter was a plain black folder. Inside, the recovered footage, a printed copy of the house deed, my living will, and Nadine's first draft of the complaint. Then I sat down. I breathed in deeply. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel everything. the profound betrayal, the searing humiliation, the deep, bone-aching ache of being seen as disposable by the very people I had given so much to. But beneath the ache, something else had begun to bloom, a quiet, unyielding resolve, not to punish for petty vengeance, but to reclaim not just my name, not just my house, but my dignity, my very place in the world, and I knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who had faced down countless challenges, that this was only the beginning. I woke up before the sun rose, out of absolute, unwavering clarity. There was a strange, almost comforting silence in my new apartment. I boiled water for tea, a grounding ritual, and stood in front of the plain black folder. What it held had a crushing weight. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a printed copy of the house deed, my name still there, clear as daylight, no joint ownership. I had held off signing anything for years, always feeling a small, imperceptible pull in my gut that whispered, "Wait." That quiet instinct had saved me. The second was a meticulous ledger of my financial holdings. Most of the money had accumulated over decades through quiet, strategic investments. Former clients, grateful for my integrity, had left pieces to me. I never spent much. I never needed to. I had enough, more than enough, far more than they could ever imagine. The third was the security footage, a single, frozen frame printed on the cover. My face, my hands reaching out, the split second before the fall. I closed the folder gently. Today, I would begin filing the formal paperwork with Nadine. But first, I needed to look backward one last time, to fully comprehend the tapestry of deceit. I pulled out an old notebook from my travel bag, its edges worn soft. I had used it to jot down things over the years. Conversations, dates, notes from when I first felt something was off. It wasn't the big moments, but the little ones that built the full, insidious picture. The mail being sorted before it reached the table, Bradley managing utility bills, Juliana's casual but calculated questions about inheritance, the papers I never saw again, Social Security statements, bank envelopes. I remembered asking if my Medicare card arrived and Juliana waving me off. I never found it. Alone in the kitchen, I realized what I had been feeling wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. A quiet internal alarm system ringing for months. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were actively preparing for me to disappear. Quietly, without fuss, without questions. I took a long sip of tea and stared out the window. Snow returned, fine and steady. After breakfast, I dressed with care. Not out of vanity, but purpose. Gray trousers, black turtleneck, my heavy wool coat. The same coat I wore when I signed my first leadership contract in 1984. It symbolized a lifetime of quiet authority. Today, it was my armor. I carried the folder into Nadine's office at exactly 10 a.m. Her assistant led me into a room lined with legal binders. Nadine sat behind a clean desk. She didn't offer small talk. She was a professional. She understood the weight of silence. She opened the folder, flipped through each page, and nodded. It took less than 30 minutes to confirm what I knew. I had a case. Not just for assault, though the footage was damning, but for financial manipulation, coercion, and willful neglect of a dependent elder. Colorado had clear laws on elder abuse, and Nadine had worked with judges in cases like this before, quietly, without media, but firmly. I asked her to keep everything sealed. No public filings yet. I wasn't looking for headlines. I wanted resolution. She agreed. We would move slowly, yes, but deliberately. By noon, I had signed the preliminary affidavit. By 3 p.m., copies of the footage had been secured in 2 off-site locations. By sundown, I was back at the apartment, the folder lighter in hand, but heavier in its profound impact. It would still be weeks before charges were formally filed, but the motion had begun. Once something like this starts rolling, it cannot be undone. That night, sleep was elusive. My body ached. My hands still had a slight tremor, but I no longer felt small, no longer forgotten, no longer invisible. The fog of misplaced affection had lifted. I knew the people I had raised no longer saw me clearly. They saw an obstacle, a liability, a final resource to be drained. But they didn't know everything. They didn't know the funds had already been moved to a separate holding company beyond their reach, that the trust had been updated, removing all heirs until further notice, that the title of the house was not only still in my name, but now legally shielded by a revocable trust, impenetrable. And most of all, they didn't know that the man they tried to erase had already, in the quiet of his own resolve, written the next chapter without them. It would be weeks before they noticed anything truly missing. But the silence I left behind, that, I knew, would grow louder with time. 3 days after I left Nadine's office, I received a quiet call just after 8 a.m. Her voice was even, calm, but I detected a quiet satisfaction. The paperwork was filed. The complaint was officially entered into the court system. She told me not to expect anything dramatic at first. These things take time, she explained. But it had begun. I didn't speak much, just a soft thank you. Then I hung up and stood in the middle of my small kitchen, letting the silence speak louder than words. That same afternoon, I drove to a private postal center. I handed over a pre-sealed envelope with 3 items: a copy of the complaint, a lawyer's letter requesting the return of household documents, and the notice of restricted contact. The address was Bradley and Juliana's. I didn't linger. The message was sent. The line was drawn. By the time I returned to my apartment, snow had started falling again, heavier. The kind that presses everything down, makes the world quieter, like a pot slowly building pressure. I sat by the window and opened my green notebook. Flipping back to older entries, I saw how I used to jot down things that felt too small to matter. But now, they read like a pattern, a chilling strategy. Juliana had accidentally signed for my medical statements. Bradley updated property tax info. They tried to place me on a new phone plan, but I lost access to my banking app. All of it subtle, all of it calculated. All of it now laid bare. I made a new list that day, not of what I had lost, but what I still had full control over: the deed, the trust, the footage, the law, and most important of all, myself. The following morning, Nadine emailed me a case update. The court had issued a preliminary review date, the footage would be used as direct evidence, and a temporary restraining order could be put in place. I didn't celebrate, but I felt something settle inside me: alignment. That week, I met with Marcus, an estate planner. I told him to prepare documents to move the bulk of my holdings into a new foundation, a nonprofit trust to support career retraining and wellness resources for women over 60, especially widows. I had seen the silent struggles of friends, and a quiet fire of purpose had been kindled. This was a legacy beyond mere money. Marcus didn't blink. He asked smart questions, gave timelines. I left his office with drafts and a calendar of quiet, deliberate steps. My new life was meticulously being built. Outside, the streets were slick. I walked slower than usual, not because I was tired, but because I could afford to. I wasn't rushing to prove anything. I was simply moving forward. I spent that night going through old photo albums, not out of sentiment, but truth. I wanted to see the moments I had forgotten, the smiles that were real. One photo stuck out: Bradley at 12, sitting beside me on the hospital lawn. He wasn't cruel then. He was just a boy with too much emotion. A boy I thought I understood. I held that photo for a long time, not to justify, but to remember where we had come from, to understand how far we had truly fallen. A few days later, I received a voicemail from Juliana. Her voice was tight, professional. She said they had received my lawyer's letter and were surprised at the accusations. She hoped we could resolve this privately. No apology, no regret, just a desperate attempt at control. She sounded more worried about the paper trail than the glass shards still lingering in my back. I didn't respond. Nadine would handle all contact. I wasn't going to argue. Instead, I prepared. I made extra copies of documents, storing them securely. I scheduled a second appointment with Marcus to finalize the first portion of funds for the foundation. I purchased a new jacket. The old one with the faint bloodstain I folded and placed in a sealed bag, not to forget, but to preserve the stark line between before and after. Then I went for a walk. The wind was sharp, but I didn't flinch. My body had adjusted to discomfort. But my mind? My mind was clearer than ever. They thought pushing me through glass would break me. What they didn't realize was that some glass breaks clean, but the man standing on the other side can come out sharper, not bitter, but precise. And now I had precision, and paperwork, and patience, and the unyielding force of the law. The apartment grew quieter. Snow piled against the window. Each morning I woke with the same rhythm. Tea first, then documents, then walking. It became a quiet ritual. On the fifth morning, I drove west, towards the mountains. I didn't tell anyone. I left early with a small bag and the new coat. I had made a reservation under a different name, a habit picked up managing high-profile staff who needed discretion. The road twisted through tall pines. The sky hung low. When I arrived in Aspen, the snow was thicker. The air felt cleaner. I checked into a small cabin near the springs. I wasn't there for leisure. I was there to breathe in silence, to remember who I was before the noise, before the betrayal. That evening I soaked in the outdoor pool. The water was warm against the cold air. I stayed beneath the surface longer than usual, not to forget, but to empty myself, to make room. The next morning, I woke early and sat on the wooden deck, wrapped in a blanket. I sipped coffee and thought about the version of myself that used to make excuses for Bradley's dismissive behavior. The man who said, maybe he's just stressed. I had stopped making excuses the day my back hit glass. Now, I looked back with sharper eyes. I began making new outlines, not for court dates, but for how I would live if I no longer needed to explain myself. That same day, I walked into town and stopped at a quiet bookstore. The owner, Ruth, still remembered me. I picked out books about quiet individuals who changed their lives late in life. I left without announcing who I was. I didn't need to be the man with grievances, not today. By the third day, the cabin felt like it belonged to me. Not because I owned it, but because I had brought myself there by choice. It's the profound difference between escaping and truly returning to oneself. I wrote letters that night, not to Bradley, not to Juliana, letters to myself, to the version of me at 40 who spent birthdays alone, to the version at 50 who helped them buy their first house but wasn't invited to their housewarming, to the version at 60 who quietly paid their credit card debt. I wrote to each of those former selves and told them they did what they could with the knowledge they had. I forgave them, and I thank them, because without them I wouldn't be here, strong enough to walk away, smart enough to plan ahead, quiet enough to let truth do the work. That night the snow turned violent. Winds howled against the windows, rattling the glass, reminding me how fragile walls can be. But the fireplace stayed lit, and the roof held strong. I didn't feel unsafe. I felt awake. The next morning I checked out early. The road back was slick, but I didn't rush. At every curve I thought about what came next. I knew Nadine would be preparing. I knew Juliana would respond with charm or outrage. I knew Bradley would do what he had always done, go quiet, then passive. But I wasn't going back into that house. I wasn't going back into that old version of myself either. Instead, I drove straight to the building that would hold my newly registered foundation. The paperwork finalized 2 days before. I hadn't told anyone. It was my private start. I walked up to the receptionist, handed over my ID, and smiled when she said the name, the Montreux Initiative. I asked her to say it again. A place for women over 60 to rebuild, quietly, powerfully, on their own terms. I walked into the small office reserved for me and sat down. No ceremony, but inside, I felt something shift, something real, something profoundly right. Bradley once told me I was too sensitive. Now I took things personally on purpose, not out of pain, but clarity. Because sometimes, after the snow settles, you realize the path wasn't lost. It was just covered. And now I was walking it on my own terms. The first time I saw Juliana again, it wasn't in a courtroom. It was at a property showcase. The firm she worked with was hosting a tour of renovated homes. One home had been funded by a private investment group. What Juliana didn't know was that the group had recently come under new management. Quietly, discreetly. That new management was me. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing dark sunglasses. I walked the house like any other guest, listening to Juliana's polished voice. She looked the same. Perfect hair, firm voice, that overly gracious tone she always used when selling. When she turned and caught sight of me, I saw her expression flicker, then she composed herself. I didn't give her the chance to react. Instead, I walked into the master bedroom. Chloe, her assistant, followed me. "This is a private showing," she said, arrogant. I turned slowly and handed her a business card with the investment firm's name. My name was listed under strategic partner. Her eyes widened. She stammered something about checking with Juliana. "Take your time," I told her. "I'll be in the sunroom." 10 minutes later, Juliana came in. She didn't greet me. She just looked at the card, then at me. I saw the raw panic beneath her calm. "Have you reviewed the latest sponsorship ledger, Juliana?" I asked, voice even. She didn't answer. I knew. Her company had taken a bridge loan from silent backers. When I assumed management, I became a silent partner, not for overt power, but for positioning, for control. Juliana stood rigid, her eyes calculating. She knew this wasn't random. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. I told her simply that everything had a paper trail. All things left behind eventually led back home. And then I left. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need a confrontation. The point was to remind her she had underestimated the wrong man. That evening I sat at a small cafe sipping black tea. A young waitress asked if I needed anything else. I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile, and said, "No, thank you." For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. Later that night, Nadine forwarded new correspondence. The investigation had moved to active motion. Interviews, depositions, hearings. A list of sealed evidence, the footage, sworn affidavits from neighbors, Bradley's attempts to consolidate my utility bills. Slow progress, but solid. That same week, I received notification that the Montreux Initiative trust paperwork had gone through. The bank confirmed the first transfer settled. $5 million for operational costs and endowments. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I thought about what Juliana might have told Bradley when she got home. I wouldn't know. That part didn't belong to me anymore. What mattered was that the ground beneath their feet had begun to shift. And I was no longer standing still. I didn't hear from Bradley directly. His sudden retreat spoke volumes. Juliana, however, couldn't help herself. Less than a week after the showcase, Nadine forwarded a message from Juliana's legal team. They claimed misunderstandings and emotional misjudgments. They suggested an outside-of-court resolution with privacy and cessation of all pending motions. They wanted a deal. I didn't respond. Nadine did. Her reply was brief. "The process will continue. No further commentary will be entertained." The email chain stopped. Later that day, Marcus called. His voice had a tightness. He had received an unexpected inquiry regarding a parcel linked to my trust. Someone was trying to poke holes. I asked what he needed. He paused, then told me he already handled it. Documents were reinforced. Still, he wanted to keep me in the loop. After we hung up, I sat in my living room staring out at the snow. I wasn't surprised. I had expected pushback. But this was desperation disguised as strategy. That evening, I reviewed the properties Bradley once asked me to co-sign for. I had declined politely. Something about the way he worded it, like it was my duty as a father, made me hesitate. I hadn't known why. Now it felt like instinct had protected me. Quiet, stubborn. Next morning, Nadine sent another update. Preliminary discovery was closing, a promotion hearing was scheduled, evidence would be released to both sides, the footage would become a matter of public record. I spent that afternoon walking through the local arboretum. There was comfort in moving forward while everything else stood still. I thought about the last Christmas in that house. Juliana ordered catering, Bradley barely spoke, grandkids ignored my gifts. I remembered seeing my reflection distorted in a glass ornament. I didn't know it was the last time I'd sit at that table. But now I was glad. I might have stayed out of guilt, and guilt was no reason to keep bleeding. Later that week, the court issued a formal notice, the hearing in 2 weeks. No drama, no cameras, just a judge, attorneys, documentation, the beginning of truth spoken aloud. Meanwhile, I kept moving. I met with the Foundation's first advisors. Women from different parts of the state. Some lost spouses, some homes, all overlooked. As I listened, I realized, for all the silence I endured, I never lost my voice. I just spoke to the wrong people. After the meeting, Janice, a woman with soft eyes, told me she saw how I listened, not just to reply, but to hold space for others' truth. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in a long time. That night, I pulled out the folder, my medical files, financial records, the footage. I placed it in a new fireproof safe. It was no longer just protection. It was preparation. The house Bradley and Juliana tried to control was no longer theirs. The bank froze their credit, the mortgage flagged, everything was shaking. And they had no idea how still I had become. Because stillness, I learned, is not weakness. It is waiting with intention. And I was done waiting. It started with a call from Nadine on a Thursday morning. Her tone changed. The house was officially under investigation, the footage reviewed. They were taking it seriously. An official site visit. Officers sent out to see where it happened. Juliana had called the court frantic. I felt no satisfaction, only stillness, like watching the first cracks spread through a frozen pond. I didn't ask for details. Nadine would handle it. I needed to stay steady, no contact, no sudden movements. The process was working. Later that day, I sat at my table. Snow melted outside, sun on my face, quiet, warm, unbothered. That afternoon, a message from an unfamiliar number. Your neighbors are talking. What are you doing to us? No name, but Bradley's number. He hadn't spoken to me in months. I didn't respond. I passed it to Nadine. That evening, I walked near the courthouse. I passed one legal office that rejected me once, just a bruised wrist and trembling voice. Now, I walked past without bitterness. I had Nadine. A file the size of a hardback novel. Official attention. At home, I reviewed the timeline, how long it took for truth to take shape. The fall, the silence, the motel, the unanswered questions, the unoffered apology, the first email to Nadine, the footage, the filing, the letters, the pushback, the showcase, the call from Marcus, the trust, the hearing, the site visit. None of it overnight, but together it built something undeniable. The next morning, officers visited the house. Mrs. Kendall, 2 doors down, gave a sworn statement. She saw me leave that night. Torn coat, blood. She was afraid before, but the footage changed that. It was fact. Nadine said there was talk of formally charging Bradley and Juliana. Assault, endangerment, concealment of evidence. They waited too long. That weekend, I visited the foundation office, a new sign, the Montreux Initiative. A young intern greeted me. She offered to show me around, not knowing who I was. I preferred to walk alone. I moved slowly, looking at the books, supplies, grant applications from women who had lived quietly too long. I lingered in the conference room. A life looks ordinary on paper, but decisions shaping it come quietly. Like sitting in a courtroom, not as accused, but witness. Like hearing your son's name tied to charges, like knowing you didn't raise your voice, but you raised the truth. I left as the sun dipped. On the drive home, Nadine called. The county clerk received a sealed filing from Juliana's attorney, early mediation, voluntary, private, a last attempt to avoid charges. They knew what was coming. They were afraid. I pulled over, rolled the window down. Air stung my face. I didn't feel victorious. I felt awake, alive, unbroken. The court date wasn't loud. A small courtroom, windows facing bare trees, cold, smelling of old carpet. I arrived early, dressed in navy, wearing my late wife's watch, not for comfort, but to remember the years I held everything together for others. Today was about ownership. Nadine was already seated, papers like soldiers. Her calm presence steadied the air. She nodded. Across the aisle, Bradley sat stiffly. His suit didn't fit. His eyes flickered towards me, then dropped. Juliana entered minutes later, all black, no jewelry, not even her wedding ring. She didn't sit with Bradley. She sat alone, arms folded tightly. The judge arrived, a woman with steel gray hair, voice like dry wood snapping. She read the charges. Misdemeanor elder abuse, obstruction of reporting, attempted property coercion. 3 charges, echoing in the space. I didn't look at Bradley. Then evidence. Nadine stood, precise, presented the footage, a large monitor, no sound, just video. I watched, Bradley's arm, my body staggering, glass shattering. I disappeared. Silence. Then it ended. No gasp, just stillness. The judge wrote. Then statements. Nadine kept it short. Facts. My injury, delay in reporting, intimidation attempts, Bradley's attempts at asset transfers. A pattern, subtle but clear. Bradley's attorney, deflection, stress, miscommunication, unintentional harm. A son pushed too far. Juliana was asked to speak. She shook her head. Her lawyer leaned in. No words. Her silence was the loudest thing she ever said to me. The judge didn't deliberate long. No full sentence. Just the evidentiary hearing. But she ruled the case would proceed. Evidence warranted further action. Protective order extended. Bradley ordered no contact. Juliana as well. Financial access frozen, shared accounts audited. Investigation expanded. The gavel came down. I didn't exhale. I stood, nodded to Nadine, and walked out without looking back. Outside, wind picked up. Leaves scraped. I walked slowly, every step earned. At a cafe, I ordered coffee. No one recognized me. I opened my notebook, drew a line through today's date, turned the page, wrote one sentence. I am not broken. When I returned home, a handwritten letter from Bradley, plain envelope, uneven writing. He was sorry, under pressure, didn't know what came over him, didn't expect it to go this far. Asked me to remember the boy he used to be. I read it, folded it, placed it in a drawer, not out of bitterness, but because forgiveness is a process, not a performance. That night I sat by the window, lights off. I didn't cry, didn't smile, just sat in the quiet. The house they tried to take restored to my name. Deed corrected, will updated. My foundation gained nonprofit status, first board meeting in 2 weeks. Lives I would help change, not out of revenge, but because I could. That was power, not the kind that shouts, the kind that builds. I sat on the edge of my new bed, the letter still tucked away. I'd thought about it. Not his words, but what he didn't say, what he didn't understand. All those years I held my tongue, let myself shrink, let them speak over me. Not because I didn't know better, but because I thought love meant choosing peace over pride. Being a good father meant enduring. That day in court, when he couldn't look me in the eye, I understood. I raised a son on subtle fear. Don't push too hard. Don't expect too much. Now I saw that child reflected in the man, a man who learned guilt could be brushed off. Apologies were enough, forgiveness automatic, a cycle I inadvertently perpetuated. I stood and walked to the window, snow falling, city moving, but calm. I breathed slowly, the tightness in my chest was gone. The next morning I attended a community roundtable. Dozens of women came, some alone, some with daughters, some with notebooks full of dreams. I watched them speak, nervous at first, then stronger. Something holy about how they listened. No judgment, just shared ache and recognition. During a break, Felicia sat beside me. 65, divorced, her son moved away. She told me she thought invisibility was part of aging. I told her I mistook silence for strength too. Then maybe it's time we rewrite what strength looks like, she said. Later, walking to my car, I passed a bookstore. Local authors reading Mech Saturday. I smiled. It wasn't about being seen. It was about finally seeing myself clearly. At home, I prepared tea. Opened a blank notebook. Reminded me of writing notes for Bradley's lunches. You've got this. I believe in you. Now I wrote those words to myself. The next morning, Marcus called. Final audits. Every attempt Bradley and Juliana made to touch my assets failed. Fraudulent requests, disguised inquiries, manipulative paperwork, all documented, all blocked, all traceable. Marcus's voice carried quiet pride. A law student offered to take the case further. Not for punishment, but precedent. The footage, the pattern, my endurance. Systemic elder abuse. She wanted to raise awareness. I gave consent. Not because I wanted my story told, but for others like me to know they weren't alone. That same week, Juliana's name removed from properties she leveraged. Bank reversed transfers. No legal claim. Bradley's accounts frozen. Judge set review hearing for financial restitution. I felt no triumph. Instead, a soft clearing, a quiet path opening. That weekend I returned to Aspen. Walked the trails from months ago when I ran unsure. This time, not escaping, but returning. On the last stretch, near the ridge, I closed my eyes, thought about that night, the glass, the silence, the ache. I whispered softly, not to him, but to myself. You didn't deserve that. Not the push, not the neglect, not the years of being talked over, looked past, depended on only when convenient. Not the assumption that you, the father, would always be there, always say yes, always stay small. You didn't deserve any of it, and you survived it anyway. You are Arthur Jensen. That night, I slept without waking. The first full, unbroken sleep in years. No memories chasing me, just rest, just breath, just peace. It was never about revenge in the petty sense. It was about reclaiming the voice I'd buried beneath years of quiet accommodation. And now that I had it back, clear and resonant, I wasn't going to let it go. I walked into the office that Monday morning, snow falling. The Montreux Initiative had grown. Walls held framed photographs of women we'd helped, smiling faces, graduation certificates. In the main room, the new coordinator set up for a workshop. She looked up, nodded, went back to organizing. I wasn't being tiptoed around. I was just another contributor. I walked into the founder's room, opened the side drawer, removed the sealed packet, the last financial paperwork, full transfer of my remaining assets into the trust. $21 million. Still didn't feel real. Signed, sealed, legally untouchable. Not just for tax protection, but because I wanted the money to outlive me in a way that didn't carry blood or guilt. I wanted it to build something true. I sat at the long table, read the final statement. Lawyers double-checked every number, nothing left with my name except one line. Permanent designated use. Empowerment of older women in transition. I signed slowly, carefully, signing goodbye to a version of myself afraid of his own worth. That evening, I drove to the old house one final time. New owners, retired. They hadn't heard of Bradley or Juliana, told it was tied up in probate. They just wanted a quiet home. I stood across the street, porch light on, wind chimes swayed. Barely saw the faint mark where glass splintered. They replaced it. I didn't need to reclaim it physically. I had done that in a more profound way. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed. Nadine. Final judgment. Bradley restricted financial access for 5 years. Required counseling for abusive behavior. Juliana agreed to settle. Relinquishing claims. Withdrawing appeal. No trial. Just like that, it was over. Not loudly, not with headlines, but with signatures, and with silence. The silence of consequence. I drove back to my apartment, sat in the car, letting the weight press gently. No screaming, no confrontations, just quiet consequence. I went inside, opened the window, snow falling, soft now, like ash after a fire. In the weeks that followed, I rarely thought of Bradley, not out of spite, but because the version of him I carried no longer lived in my mind. The father of my grandson, the boy I held through flu, the man who forgot I was human. He would carry his consequences. I would carry peace, clarity, purpose. In a staff meeting, a young intern asked how we decide who receives support. I told her, we look for women who remind us of the quiet strength of the women who shaped our lives, not to save them, but to stand beside them while they learn to save themselves. She understood. That night I sat by the window, pen in hand, not to write a letter, just to mark the day. I wrote one line. Justice isn't always loud, but when it's real, it doesn't need to be. Underlined it slowly, once. Closed the book, turned out the light. The lake behind my apartment froze in early January. I watched it slowly, ripples becoming reflections, silence. That morning, I walked the trail around it, coffee in gloved hand, air cold but not bitter, clean, like something had finally settled. I just left the last board meeting. Over 200 women came through, some employed, others training, a few in housing. Donna, 70s, started bookkeeping. Cried in my office when she got her first clients. Thought life was done with me, she whispered. Turns out, I just needed a second wind. I stopped at the bench near the willow tree. Used to be hard to sit still. I always felt I had to prove something. But I learned being quiet wasn't invisible, and being strong didn't mean being silent when silence was weakness. But it meant choosing silence when it was a strategy. My phone buzzed. Nicole, my granddaughter. A photo. A sketch of a man sitting at a window, cup in hand, looking at snow. Underneath, I remember you like this. I didn't respond. Not yet. My heart, too full. Not with grief, with something heavier, softer. Forgiveness, perhaps. Not of Bradley, not of Juliana, but of myself. For all the years I thought my value depended on how much I endured without complaint. I walked back slowly, crunch of snow under each step. Reached the door, turned, once more, to the lake, then stepped inside, closed it gently. Later that night, I packed a suitcase. For a few days in the cabin near Aspen, the one I'd purchased quietly, a place entirely mine. Before I left, I looked in the hallway mirror. My reflection didn't shock me. Lines there, gray threaded. But eyes, different. Not hardened. Clear. I whispered something, only for myself to hear. You kept going. And I meant it. Because I had. Through the doubt, through the profound betrayal, through the agonizing silence, through the long nights of thinking maybe I'd imagined it all, that maybe I'd been too much or not enough. But I had been enough all along. I just needed to remember how to stand on my own ground. And now, I had. If you've ever chosen silence because no one would listen, if you've ever been dismissed or forgotten by the people you love, by the very family you built, then this story was meant for you. Share how you feel after hearing this journey. You never know. Your words might be the light someone else needs while walking through their darkest moment. We read every comment, even the quietest whispers. This isn't just a storytelling channel. This is where silence gets heard, and where true, wise revenge finds its voice.